Well, hey there, everybody. It's Snackbox coming to you from a beautiful day down here in Basement Studio. Really excited to be here talking to you about this guy here. This is the Gossamer Gear the One. This puppy is going to be my home for the entire month of July when I go back out and do the Colorado Trail for another trip down there from Denver to Durango. Really amped about this tent. This is one of the few that when I first saw it, I fell in love immediately. And I thought, you know what? Once I have it, let's take it out, get some first looks and see if it's really going to live up to the hype. So we've got a lot to cover, not a lot of time. Let's get to it, everybody. See this hoodie here? Really excited about it as well. Before we get started, this is from BTT Gear Company off of Etsy. This is just the most comfortable, it's not the one brand, that you need to win the lottery and sell some children to get, but it is more comfortable and you can order it offline. So love it. Let's get started. Let's talk about just some of the basics of the Gossamer Gear the One. And this tent here is a really interesting one because it is a trekking pole tent. For those of you who are unfamiliar, what this means is that it integrates two trekking poles instead of using a pole system that you have to carry in addition to your trekking poles. So it's a great way to save a little bit of space, great way to actually set it up and really get some secure setups if you figure out exactly how to stake it in and really figure out the ins and outs. So if you do pick up a trekking pole tent, which I absolutely think you should, you want to practice setting it up a few times so you really figure out how to get a good setup on it. You're going to need 6 stakes to set this up. It does come with 6 stakes. It is a 1-person tent. There is a 2-person design, but we are just talking about the 1-person, and we're talking specifically about the 2021 edition. And this was an update from Gossamer Gear, really making it better and dialing in some of those things that previous models didn't necessarily have. We're not going to get into a whole lot of those differences because ultimately I want us to focus in on this tent and talk a lot about it because I really do think this is a pretty decent tent and it's a nice midpoint for a lot of people who are looking for a tent that isn't necessarily the cheapest tent, those sort of Amazon tents that I've talked about before, but they're also not the Cuban fiber tents that are really expensive, $600-700. So this one is a really nice midpoint. It's priced at $300, right at $299, and you can also get a ground sheet for it for $11, or you can get the alternate poles if you don't carry trekking poles, or if you're like my wife and have trekking poles that are too short to work with this. It requires 45-inch trekking poles or the capacity to go 45 inches. So if you don't have trekking poles that will reach that distance, they do sell poles that you can use instead. And so those run in at about $38. So factor those into this cost configuration as you're really thinking through how much this is going to cost you, because that's really the name of the game with a lot of these tents. You want to figure out exactly what those numbers are, because as we're going to see in a couple of different places, sometimes the first number you see isn't the exact number we're dealing with. And there are some reasons for it that are not necessarily nefarious. That's your word of the day, nefarious. So there's some reasons that the numbers you'll get from Gossamer Gear can seem a little bit off, and we want to talk about that, but that's the case with any of these trekking pole tents. So let's talk a little more about some of those details. I already mentioned it's 45 inches in height, and on the head space, so where you put your head, that will be 33 inches in width, and it will taper down to 21 inches at your feet, which is more than plenty of space for the standard sleeping pad. It's also nice because it gives you a little bit of extra room to put some of your gear inside, and it does have a vestibule on the side of the tent where you will enter and exit. On the other side of the tent, rather than a vestibule, it will have a sort of catenary cut where you'll have a big ventilation area with some bug netting, and that's really critical for these single wall tents where you don't have a bug net and then a rain fly going over it, because you tend to get a lot more condensation in a single wall tent. It does have some air vents at the head and foot as well. The whole side with the door is also bug net, so there's some good ventilation there through the vestibule, especially if you're mindful of this when you set up your tent. You don't block off the airflow with your gear. So as long as you maintain and really protect that ventilation, you should be pretty good, I believe, with this tent in terms of condensation. But I'm going to report back on that because I've had a number of these single wall tents. I did the trail last year with the 6 Moon Designs Hawaii. It's a 2-person tent, and it was a single wall condensation machine. But in 2020, when I hiked the Colorado Trail, I took the 6 Moon Designs Deschutes Plus, which was a single wall tent as well, floorless design, really a competitor here with the Gossamer Gear. And that tent was really nicely vented and didn't really run into a lot of condensation issues unless I was in really humid areas like Snow Mesa. One night I ended up with some pretty good condensation in the morning, but that was after a really heavy rain as well. So I think this one is going to fare pretty well by way of that ventilation. The tent comes with with 8 stakes, and it comes with 2 extra guy out lines for using those tie out points on the long side of the tent, and it also comes with a line for the ridge line so you can put up your laundry and hang up clothes. I think these are great additions, and they're a great value add from Gossamer Gear that they didn't have to do, but they included them, and I thought that was just a nice addition. It does require 2 different trekking poles, but also if you set this up near trees or somewhere where you can stake it out to other people's trekking poles if you borrow them, there are 2 guy out points on the long side of the tent where you can pull it out and get a little more headroom or foot room. It's an interesting choice given that you already need 2 trekking poles to just set it up. You won't be able to do that everywhere, especially if you're in some high elevation like you see behind me, because you won't have anything to tie it off to using your 2 trekking poles inside the tent, just as it's very structured to begin with. Now, one of the ways that they make this tent so light, it comes in at 17.7 ounces advertised. When I weighed it, it was closer to about 18.5 ounces, but it still had the guy outlines on it. And so I think it is coming in at 17.7 if you're just talking the tent. Now, here's where it gets really tricky and where it gets to be kind of a complicated mess in some respects. Because people who purchase tents like this tend to be very specific in what they want, they tend to trade out a lot of different things. I mentioned already that I plan to trade out the stakes, for example. So a lot of times the different manufacturers of these smaller trekking pole tents won't list the pieces as a whole set, right? So if you buy, say, a Big Agnes copper spur, they're going to advertise the sort of standard configurations that you would need to set it up. But when you're talking about some of these where you have a lot more option and a lot more customization from people who really know what they want in a tent, they list each piece individually. So when you go to the Gossamer Gear website, they will tell you what the stakes weigh. They will tell you what the ridge line weighs, what the different guy outlines weigh, because they expect many of the people who purchase this tent to swap them out anyway. What that means, though, is that 17.7 weight that you see advertised on the Gossamer Gear page is just the tent shell itself. It doesn't include things like the guy outlines, the stakes, etc. So you have to factor that in. And the whole setup that they send you really does come in closer to about 22 ounces. I still think that's super nice and super light, really nicely done. And if you see here in the picture, it's not that much bigger than a Nalgene. So it is really a terrifically sized tent, especially if you're hoping to shrink down your actual backpack size. Absolutely think it's a great idea, but be mindful of the fact that 17.7 ounces is not a functional tent. You won't be able to set it up with that because you still need to include things like stakes, and you absolutely need at least 6 stakes for this tent to function at all. One of the best features of this tent is the offset ridgeline. When you look at the tent, what you will find is that the ridgeline, the sort of peak of it, is closer to your head than your feet. And that's because your body from your waist up is shorter than from your waist down when you sit up. So they move it, and that gives you a lot more functional space. A lot of times when you get into a tent, they'll have lots of space, but because of the way it's broken up, you won't actually be able to use very much of it because of the way your body actually exists in that space. So for example, when I used the 6 Moon Designs Deschutes Plus, the pole was right in the center, which meant all of that space where I would normally sit was not really usable because I'd basically need my back to be as close to that pole as possible, and that limited the amount of the footprint I could actually use. This tent, by contrast, moves that center line over to where you get a whole lot more usable space, and because it uses 2 trekking poles, I expect I will have a lot more headroom in this, and I will even be able to hang up some clothes inside the tent to dry after long days, or if we end up in rain, that kind of thing. So I love that design. Now, one of the ways that they save a lot of weight is that they use a 10D or 10 denier sil nylon ripstop fabric. This is a really nice fabric. You feel it. It is super soft. Whenever you check it out, it is just really incredibly light. And that is a great feature, especially if you're good at taking care of your gear. What you need to know, though, is that these are very light, very thin materials. And even though it's ripstop, you still need to be very cognizant of where you set it up and make sure that you are not putting it in a position where it might get ripped. They do sell the polycro footprint for it for about $11. I think that's a great investment for people just to have with them because that polycro is super light. But if you're buying a tent like this, chances are good you're really trying to get that weight down. So it's something you certainly want to factor in, that it's more weight added to a really ultralight tent. And if you're spending $300 to shrink your pack size, sometimes it might make sense to buy a cheaper tent with a thicker denier, because a 20 denier would be effectively the same thickness as the 10 denier with the polycro. So just one of those things that you want to factor in. But one of the nice things about this tent is that it is seam taped from the factory. One of my big pet peeves with my 6 moon tents, and I love 6 moon tents, is that they will quote a weight, but they don't have the tent seam sealed. So it's kind of like you get into a brand new car and they tell you that if you get in rain, the windshield is still going to leak because it's not ready yet. So that tent actually isn't ready at all for the trail. You either have to pay them to seam seal the tent, or you have to undertake a really messy process of seam sealing your. And I think that's just a problem. And it's also a problem because the 16 ounces they quoted me for the Deschutes Plus was actually not the actual weight, because that seam sealant, when you spread it out over every seam, adds a couple of ounces. And so it's one of those things where 6 Moons has decided that their best route is to offer this as a service to you, but it means the numbers get fudged a little bit. Whereas I love the way Gossamer Gear just says, you know what, we're going to do that for you already. And even with that and a floor to their tent, they still come in at about the same weight as you would get with that 6 Moon Designs tent. I think the fact that they seam tape it for you is a big advantage that you want to factor in, because if you have to pay somebody to do that, or if you have to do it for yourself, I would estimate that's probably about a $30 job, or it's worth about $30 of your time and the materials to do it yourself, not counting even the mess of it, because it is a pretty messy process. I've done it a times already. So I've already talked about some of the advantages here. This tent has really good ventilation, especially for a single wall tent, and it has that offset peak, which I think is just a dynamite feature. One of the features that I absolutely love about this tent is the vestibule. So the vestibule has a lot of really good usable space, and it also can be tied back on those clearer nights. So they have tie outs on both sides of the vestibule, so you can tie out the flaps and open it up on some of those clear Colorado nights when you're hiking the trail. What's also really nice is for that vestibule, they use what's called a TPU zipper. You've seen these zippers before, probably on waterproof bags, maybe for a waterproof backpack. And they're basically those zippers that when you zip them, the rubber folds over the zipper part and makes them waterproof. This is really great, not even so much because of the waterproofing element of it, but I love this zipper because the way usually a tent company will make their zipper waterproof is they will include a flap of nylon that goes over the zipper. That makes it waterproof, but it also gives the tent something to get caught on. And that can be a real hassle whenever you're inside a tent trying to unzip something and make sure that you can get out, because it's always kind of a game of twister when you're trying to grab that zipper and pull. So the fact that they thought to use this type of zipper here, I think is just brilliant. So let's go ahead and nail down the exact benefits of this tent. One of the big benefits is that it is really small, really light. I love the design of it, and it is super easy to set up. This one, compared to a lot of other trekking pole tents, is very, very easy. I set it up 2 or 3 times already, and each time I got increasingly quick with it. And it is particularly good because it doesn't tend to tip over very often when you have just one trekking pole in, which is a pretty critical thing for people who are learning how to set up a trekking pole tent. Really terrific and really good for people who might be nervous about moving from a freestanding tent to one that has to be staked in. In this situation, this is a great tent for people who are moving over to a tent that is much lighter but still needs to be staked in and it isn't freestanding. Now let's talk about a few of the different quibbles that I have with the design of this tent and some of the things that you need to know that are not so great. Probably my biggest quibble with this is the placement of the entry zipper. So remember a while ago I told you that this tent has an offset peak, and what that means is you have 2 different places you could put the zipper. One of those placement options is to the right of the trekking pole, which would be where your feet go. Where they chose to put it, however, is to the left of the trekking pole, which is where your head goes. And if you think about the geometry of your body and where you need to go to get in, this is a really bad place for it relative to the other option, because when you unzip that, you have to put your butt in on your pillow and then swing your legs in, rather than being able to climb into the tent where you climb in and put your head right on your pillow right away, and you never run the risk of putting your dirty feet on your pillow, that sort of thing. So I don't love the placement of the zipper, and I have to imagine that the reason they chose to put it there has something to do with weight, because when you're talking in the tenths of ounces, adding an extra foot of zipper can add an ounce or better to the design of a tent. And so I don't love the placement of the zipper, and I think that it makes it really sort of awkward to climb in and out of the tent whenever they put it there. So I wish it would have been on the other side of the trekking pole so that you could sit in the tent and then just back in and lay down and you would have been fine getting in. The second quibble that I have are the stakes that they send along. So they do send along 8 stakes, but these are stakes that I would want to replace almost immediately. Relatively light, they're not terribly heavy. I believe they're quoted in at about 7 grams a piece, but they feel flimsy. They don't feel like they're really going to hold up. And the guy lines that they put on them, these here break really easily in my experience. So I don't personally love these. I would replace them. But again, that's part of the reason that they don't include the weight. This is a small quibble. And I think for any of you out there, I would just imagine every time you buy a tent, you're going to want to dress up those stakes anyway. So think about it a little bit like when you buy a new car, you want to get the windows tinted on those immediately. Same thing holds true here. These are not even name brand DAC. I don't know why we would necessarily want to have these sort of cheaper ones in here. I kind of feel like it'd be better just to exclude them and lower the price a little bit, or perhaps offer a nicer option as an alternative or an add-on. And I think that would be a great way for Gossamer gear to go and still be able to sort of maintain that quality, the standard of quality, because this is a really nicely made tent. And I do think that this is a bit of a higher end tent for a lot of people. So pairing it with some cheaper stakes, I kind of wish they wouldn't have done that, or I wish they would have at least paired it with some options to get nicer stakes as sort of upgrades to that package. I think that's a nice way that Gossamer gear could have really stepped it up a little bit in this regard. So the only other big quibble that I have is in the place where you can fold out the vestibule, roll it up, and then tie it up to the tent, they chose to use an elastic band to hold back the vestibule door. Now, this is not a big deal in and of itself, but there are a couple of problems with using elastic on the outside. Number one, when it stretches and when it gets exposed to sun, it will tend to stretch and eventually fail, which I don't think is great. The second thing is, this is on the outside, it is covered with a fabric that will get wet. So where tents are usually very quick to dry, they put a piece on the outside of the tent that is likely to be very difficult to dry. So it will create this added sort of pressure whenever you are getting rained on, that you'll need to get it dry pretty quickly, or else it'll end up mildewing because you'll have 2 little balls of water within your tent. So I don't love that. And I know that Gossamer gear can create tie outs for the same spot using sil nylon instead, which I personally think is a better option. And I know they can do it because the points where you tie the tent to the trekking poles are made of sil nylon tie back toggle switches, whatever you want to call them. And so I was a little bummed out about that. I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do think that eventually it's a part that is going to fail. And I can't say that for sure, but it does seem like the kind of thing that the design wasn't really thought through super well on that. Or I don't know, maybe I'm just wrong about that, but I don't love that design. And I expect that it's going to be an added hassle whenever I get rained on at night, because I'll have to wait for an extra thing to dry that's not nearly as quick to dry as sil nylon. So I think overall, if you're looking for a great tent that's a trekking pole tent for somebody taking off on a longer trip and you want something that's a little smaller, more packable, this one is just dynamite. It is one that is ready to go right out of the package. You don't have to seam tape it. I think this is a great purchase. I would encourage you to look around and see if you can get some coupon codes, because at $300, it is pretty pricey, but Gossamer gear is known for giving out discount codes, particularly to some of the podcasts that they sponsor. So pay attention to those podcasts. I listen to Backpacker Radio and found a great coupon from Gossamer gear. I think I got something like 15% off, which is no small amount of money when you're factoring in $300. It was close to $50 off. So certainly go shop around a little bit and have an eye out on it. But I think as a company goes, Gossamer gear did a really nice job with this tent. I'm super excited about it, and I have very high hopes for this tent moving forward in the future. For a tent of this size and this price and this quality, I think I might have found a tent that I'm going to use for many, many years to come. So very excited about that. If you have any questions about this tent, feel free to leave those in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. Tell me the tents you're taking out on the trail this year. I'd love to hear about them, and I'd love to hear your take on them. And be sure that you click like and subscribe so that you can follow along as I take on the Colorado Trail this summer. And hopefully I'll get to meet some of you between Denver and Durango, or if you're going to a different trail somewhere else, let me know where that is. I'm excited about all hiking and everybody taking off into the woods. So I'm really excited for you all. I appreciate you stopping in. Take care, everybody. This Snack Box out.